Well, thank you very much, Mar, for this kind introduction. I will put my headphone aside. Good afternoon, and thank you for coming. Today we gather in relation to the current exhibition, Hiperreal el arte del trampantojo, here at Museo Nacional Thyssen-Bornemisza. The art of the deceit of the eye is a fascinating subject which, as this exhibition shows, has been practiced in many countries over the course of many centuries. And you may have already heard other lectures on specific aspects of the production of hyper-illusionistic art on the occasion of this exhibition. And today, indeed, I will focus on the context and practice of trompe-l'œil in the Netherlands in the 17th century. If you wander through the galleries of Museo Thyssen-Bornemisza, you will find in the centuries prior to the 17th century already many examples of visual jokes, fantastic and masterly illusions, like this painting by Wolfgang Beurer with a fantastic suggestion of depth, or this painting by Maarten van Heemskerk with wonderful small still lifes in the background, or Marinus van Riemerswale with ambitious still life elements. The practice of such illusions has a long history and, for example, also appears in medieval illuminated Bibles. As we can see here, these wonderful decorations around the main image, and all these forms, the flowers and the birds and the jewels, are shown as if they have shadows and come loose from their surface. But in the course of the 17th century, hyper-illusionistic art as an individual challenge and ambition for artists became very popular in the Netherlands. And within that 17th century, one Dutch artist played a key role to develop this idea to an artistic concept, Samuel van Hoogstraten. He was one of the first, or the first, artist who developed the tradition of these masterly illusionistic details we saw in earlier artworks into independent subjects for paintings. In the exhibition, he is represented at hand of two works of art: a painted letter rack from the collection of the museum in Karlsruhe, in Germany, and the letter rack which belongs to the Dordrecht Museum in the Netherlands. These letter racks are a proof and symbol of Hoogstraten's success as painter of hyper-illusionistic paintings. I will discuss his work during my talk, but I will also demonstrate how, and yes, it is almost impossible not to mention his name, his teacher Rembrandt formed a decisive example for Hoogstraten to develop his specialization in illusionistic art. In a way, the question is, what is the connection between this letter rack by Hoogstraten and this world-famous painting by Rembrandt called The Night Watch? A painting you probably all know, and if not, please do come to Amsterdam to see it one day. And last but not least, I will also address some of the other Dutch artists which are represented in the exhibition. And by the time we finish this meeting, I hope you will be inspired to look at the paintings again and to see them in a somewhat broader Dutch perspective. Samuel van Hoogstraten was born in the year 1627 into an artist family from the city Dordrecht, which is not far from Rotterdam. Father Dirk van Hoogstraten was silversmith and painter, so Samuel received his first training under his father's guidance. Around 1642, shortly after his father had died, Samuel moved to Amsterdam to join Rembrandt's studio and train further under his instruction. And from about 1646, he may even have been active in Rembrandt's studio as a sort of assistant teacher, supervising training of other young artists. And in later years, back in his town of birth, he instructed several young Dordrecht painters during their first training, who then traveled to Amsterdam to finish their studies under the guidance of Rembrandt. After his stay in Rembrandt's studio in Amsterdam, Samuel van Hoogstraten sought for international fame. He traveled through Europe, via Germany to Austria, Italy, and back. And in later years, he also settled for some time in England, where he painted several portraits on commission and fantastic illusionistic architectural paintings of interiors and exteriors. But Hoogstraten was not only an artist. He was a widely talented man, a homo universalis. Not only did he practice painting, drawing, and etching, he was active as an intellectual thinker, a writer of theater plays and treatises, and in his years in Dordrecht, he also functioned as an official of the city's Mint Guild. At the end of his life, in 1678, the year of his death, he published his treatise on art with the title Inleiding tot de Hogescholen der Schilderkunst, anders de zichtbare wereld, which can be translated into English as Introduction to the Academy of Painting or the Visible World. This book forms a very important source on practical, philosophical, and theoretical ideas on art, but it also gives insight into the art lessons of Rembrandt. Rembrandt didn't leave many written statements, so Hoogstraten's book is a precious source on Rembrandt's thinking and his practice of art. Mondriaan. In order to understand certain fundamental aspects of the nature of old art, old master art, we have to start, nowadays, we all, to unthink our modern view on art. And we have to forget about the concept of abstract art. All of this didn't exist in the practice and minds of people and artists before the beginning of the 20th century. In Rembrandt's time, art on canvas or paper was always related to the suggestion of a three-dimensional world. And the title of Hoogstraten's treatise also stresses how painting was fundamentally connected to the appearance of the visible world. So the ability to create an illusion was one of the utmost basic necessities of any artist. Hoogstraten himself formulated it as follows. A perfect painting is like a mirror of nature, which shows things which are not real as if they are real, and which deceives in a decent, enjoyable, and masterful way. In Dutch 17th century treatises on art, like the one by Hoogstraten, most of the tips and tricks which are given are related to a convincing suggestion of a three-dimensional world on a flat surface. And while reading those instruction books for artists, it is fascinating to see which terminology was used to discuss, criticize, and qualify art. Interestingly enough, there are no specific words to describe the concept of illusion, even though it was so fundamental to the nature of art. The terms trompe-l'œil, deception of the eye, and quod licet, Latin for whatever you like, which was used later for the painted letter racks, which are filled with a variety of small objects, have only been used since the beginning of the 18th century. In the 17th century, the Dutch discussed quality standards of works of art at hands of words like natural, natureel, or natuurlijk in Dutch, deceptive, bedrieglijk, and perfect, volmaakt. The word composition also didn't exist in the 17th century Dutch. The word ordinantie, ordinance in English, referred to the art of composition. Ordinance, of course, focused on the arrangement of things within the suggested space, so similar to the arrangement of actors and scenery on a theater stage. A composition was not described in squares, triangles, or diagonals like we tend to do nowadays, but at hand of concepts which relate to how the visible world appears to us in reality. And two examples of those are houding, a Dutch word which means how space can be suggested through correct differences in size, lighting, and coloring of objects and persons within a certain space. So how things relate to each other in color, etc. Verscheidenheid is another concept. This is variety of types of people, objects, and colors of things. Now, within this context of fundamentally illusionistic art, Samuel van Hoogstraten developed a special passion for the depiction of the visible world. He became an important producer and promoter of hyper-illusionistic, deceptive paintings. And to understand where Hoogstraten's passion for the hyper-illusionistic art came from, we have to discuss his teacher Rembrandt. In the years prior to Hoogstraten's training, Rembrandt was already very much challenged by the possibilities and the limitations of art. He was constantly searching for new ways to surpass these limitations. In a letter from February 1636 to the Secretary of State Constantijn Huygens, Rembrandt informed Huygens on the reasons for the delay in finishing commissioned paintings. Rembrandt mentioned how he had been struggling to find ways to suggest the meeste en natuureelste bewegelijkheid, the ultimate and most natural suggestion of movement, both physically but also emotionally. And this remark is related to a passion series which he was commissioned to paint for Stadtholder Frederick Henry. He finished the series not at once, but he delivered the paintings over the course of a number of years. The letter in which he mentions the struggle with the suggestion of movement is related to these three paintings: the Entombment, Resurrection, and Ascension of Christ. Mostly the latter one shows how bystanders are moving physically, not just the people on earth, let's say, but also the angels and Christ himself, but also how people are emotionally moved by what is happening. In these same years, the late 1630s and beginning 1640s, Rembrandt also searched for the utmost illusion in portraits. For example, in portraits of preachers, he searched for ways to portray the actual main talent and profession of the sitter, speech. But hey, a painting doesn't sound. So in order to suggest the sound and the action of the spoken word, he portrayed his clients while speaking and while making gestures which symbolized speech. Speaking gestures, so a raised hand, for example, but also an open mouth. And he developed these challenges further. His mission culminated in the group portrait of the officers and other civic guardsmen of District 2 in Amsterdam under the command of Captain Frans Banning-Kok and Lieutenant Willem van Ruitenburg, known as the Night Watch, which Rembrandt finished in 1642. This is another preacher. This is the Night Watch, of course. This painting is the ultimate summum of illusion, not only of a group of people, but also of their movement and sounds. Look at how the company is starting to move under the command of their captain, who gives the sign to start marching, in a fantastic foreshortening of his hand, which stretches out of the painting towards us. And look at how a gun has been fired at this exact moment. Look at the smoke behind the head of Lieutenant van Ruitenburg. And look at how the dog is barking in a stressful response to the very first beating sound the drummer has just made. You can truly hear the noise of the scenery while looking at this silent work of art. When young Samuel van Hoogstraten arrived in Amsterdam to start his training under Rembrandt, the Night Watch was just finished and installed in the public space of the large public hall of the Kloveniersdoelen, which is in the upper left, you can see it. Upper right, sorry. This location was situated just a 5-minute walk away from Rembrandt's house at Breestraat. And standing in front of this immense painting, it must have made a huge impression on the young Samuel. And in my opinion, it must have formed a starting point for his passion for and specialization in visual tricks, trompe-l'œil. In his treatise, Hoogstraten describes only a few paintings. The Night Watch is one of them. He describes it and praises how Rembrandt applied sprong, which is a Dutch word for jump, and it refers to how the positioning of the faces within the surface of the painting moves up and down. And by applying the concept of sprong, Rembrandt was able to avoid the stiffness of traditional group portraits, in which all the heads are positioned in 1 or 2 rows, as we can see in this painting by Piquenoy, the painting which hung next to the night watch in the large hall of the Doelen. And if you draw a line, you see that all the heads are on 1, no, 2 lines. And it's fantastic because Hoogstraten describes this as a Dutch word, geschorenheid. And he describes what geschorenheid is. If you take a sword and you move with one movement, you can chop off all the heads in one movement. So this is very boring. And what Rembrandt does is that he uses sprong, beeldsprong. Beeld is face, so the movement of the placing of the heads on different positions on the surface. And then you get this, which is much more exciting. And it forces our eyes to move over the painting in a playful way. A critical remark Hoogstraten makes about the painting is that he thinks Rembrandt went a little bit too far, because some faces are not very well visible, and they're all portraits. And Rembrandt could have added more sources of light into the painting. But at hand of this and other passages of Hoogstraten's book, we can gather the terminology with which Rembrandt and his pupils have spoken about artworks like the Night Watch. Sprong or beeldsprong is one of them. Another is the way a circle-shaped group is described as kransgewijze ordinantie. And a krans is a wreath, so a wreath-shaped, a circle-shaped ordinance. And Rembrandt also did this in a Night Watch. The group is positioned in a circle. And by doing that, Rembrandt created a natural depth within the group. An empty center defines what is in front and what is in the back. And it helps in reading the direction in which these people seem to be moving towards us. Rembrandt was also very much occupied with the way colors change when things are further away or closer by or more or less lit, and how the strength of light changes depending on how close by the light source is or further away, and how light functions when it is reflected through a piece of paper or a white color. Even the thickness of air has been described by Hoogstraten, and this remark is related to the understanding of an atmospheric perspective, which makes things less strong in color and less detailed when further away. We mostly know this of being used in landscape paintings, but in a photo like this, we can also see it very clearly. Typical example of the atmospheric perspective. But Rembrandt also used this concept in the suggestion of things and people in short distances, like, for example, in this group portrait of Dr. Nicolaas Tulp and his surgeons during an anatomy lesson. The suggested space is rather shallow. Rembrandt used the table with the corpse as a center for his wreath-shaped ordinance of his figures. And besides lighting and the contrast of the flesh tone of the body and the black attires of the surgeons, he also toned down the colors of the man in the back. Now, in and after the production period of the Night Watch, Rembrandt started to experiment with portraits in even shallower spaces or depth, and he combined several illusionistic tricks in a very subtle but effective way. If we, for example, zoom in on this masterly portrait of Agatha Bas from 1641, we can see how she is positioned very much to the front. And if we start looking at details, we get the impression she is just, or she was just, moving. Her earring is a little bit up in the air and following the turning of her head towards us, viewers. But there's more to this. Rembrandt is pushing our boundaries as viewers as well, since he suggested that Agatha is grabbing her frame, a picture frame which is painted. And with her fan, she's even protruding from her own picture plane, moving outwards into our world. And here are the details. So the moving earring, the hand which grabs the painting frame, and her fan which is over the frame. So this is a fantastic example of how Rembrandt played with illusions, but also with what reality actually can be or seem. And it's funny, in our time, such ideas are mostly used in horror movies to scare us, viewers, by ghosts climbing out of mirrors. But Rembrandt used his fantasy and imagination in his lifelike portrait of this esteemed lady, and Agatha Bass must have truly enjoyed it. She and her husband were paying high prices for their portraits, so they must have had a say in the artistic concept. And he is also leaning over his painted frame. Another painting from these early 1640s is this wonderful portrayal of a girl in historic costume. She is also suggested while moving. She is moving forward, and while doing so, she's actively grabbing her very own frame. Again, like with Agatha, it is painted. Hoogstraten may have seen this painting in Rembrandt's home at Breestraat, and a copy after this painting seems to originate from the studio and may have been painted by Hoogstraten or one of his fellow pupils. In later works, Hoogstraten seems to be citing from this painting, so it must have played a role in his development. The same goes for this wonderful, intimate scene of the Holy Family in an interior. Rembrandt painted it in 1646, when Hoogstraten was finishing his training under his guidance. The importance of this painting in connection to trompe-l'œil is, of course, that Rembrandt painted not only a frame, again, around his biblical scene, but also a curtain in front of it. A curtain which is not only in itself a visual trick, but it also seems to be moving. It is suggested that it is not hanging still, but has just been moved aside. Such a painting, of course, must have been obviously connected to the ancient myth of the Greek painters Zeuxis and Parrhasius. You surely have been told about this hugely important story in other lectures and, of course, in the exhibition and catalogue. According to Pliny the Elder, Zeuxis and his contemporary Parrhasius staged a contest to determine the greater artist between them. And when Zeuxis unveiled his painting of grapes, they appeared so real that birds flew down to peck at them. But when Parrhasius, whose painting was hidden behind a curtain, asked Zeuxis to pull aside that curtain, the curtain itself turned out to be the painting. It was a painted illusion. So Parrhasius won, since Zeuxis had deceived the birds, but Parrhasius deceived a human, an artist even. Such subjects and stories were widely known and spread in books on art. It was also discussed in the Dutch book by the Haarlem painter Karel van Mander, and Rembrandt knew this book very well. This story of Zeuxis must have also been discussed in Rembrandt's studio, and artworks like the portrait of Agatha and the painting of the Holy Family prove Rembrandt's own occupation with such playful but serious artistic challenges in the years before, during, and shortly after he painted the Night Watch. His ambitious pupils from these late 1630s and the 1640s witnessed those exercises in illusionistic art, and besides Hoogstraten, also other pupils developed a special interest for it. I will show you another example of that later. First, we will focus on Hoogstraten and his art. Shortly after his training under Rembrandt, Samuel painted this fantastic self-portrait. It is a portrayal of his face and of his ability to suggest a figure leaning out of a window while drawing one of Amsterdam's church towers after life, after reality. Some years later, in 1651, he decided to travel through Europe to build a reputation, network, and clientele. And according to his first biographer, Arnold Houbraken, who had known Hoogstraten well, he presented 3 paintings at the court of Emperor Ferdinand III in Vienna. A portrait of a nobleman, a Christ with a crown of thorns, and a still life. And the illusionistic qualities of the latter impressed the emperor to such an extent that he immediately acquired the painting, saying, "This is the first painter who has truly deceived me." Hoogstraten received a golden medallion with a chain as a token of honor and appreciation. Unfortunately, these 3 paintings are, to our knowledge, lost. But throughout his life, Hoogstraten has cherished his royal award. It features in several of his paintings, also in the 2 letterworks here in the exhibition in Madrid. These were painted more than a decade later. The one, which is now owned by the museum in Karlsruhe, has the most fantastic details and illusions, effects of different types of materials and textiles. In the upper right corner, a letter is visible, on which a German text can be read. It is a poem written by Johann Wilhelm von Stubenberg, an Austrian poet who praises Hoogstraten's reputation. Translated into an English summary, it reads, "You who may doubt whether Zeuxis fooled the birds by painting grapes, come and see the work of Hoogstraten, who fooled the ruler of the world with this art." So the emperor, he fooled the emperor. Another painting he produced while being in Vienna is this portrait of a politician, Graaf Ferdinand von Weerdenberg. This impressive full-length portrait is not just a very ambitious artwork, it also is full of quotes from that specific painting which formed the starting point of Hoogstraten's development, the Night Watch. The Graaf is positioned in a combination of postures of the captain and the lieutenant from the Night Watch. And even details like the shadow which the hand of Captain Frans Banning-Kok casts on the costume of Ruitenburg, here, is quoted by Hoogstraten. And also the foreshortening of a weapon, here, is used in Hoogstraten's painting. Graaf von Weerdenberg may not have known or seen Rembrandt's Night Watch at all, but Hoogstraten cleverly leaned on his visual memory and his knowledge of this impressive work of his teacher and used it to create his own masterpiece. After his travels through Germany, Austria, Italy, he lived in Dordrecht again for some time with his wife Sarah Balen. One of the ultimate illusionistic results of his production in these years is this peep box, in which the perspective is very cleverly created. In 1662, Hoogstraten moved to London. His production there is focused on portraiture and architectural illusions, and he seeks intellectual connections. He joins the Royal Society, and his paintings and thinking becomes more scientific and intellectual. Now, as mentioned before, Hoogstraten wasn't the only Rembrandt pupil who was infected with the fascination for illusions. Ferdinand Bol is one of the others, and he is represented in the exhibition with this painting of a young man leaning on a balustrade. Bol was the first Rembrandt pupil who originated from Dordrecht. Hoogstraten was his successor in that sense. Bol trained under Rembrandt in the second half of the 1630s and left the studio just a year or two before Hoogstraten started his training. So Bol witnessed Rembrandt's development towards the Night Watch. Bol can be seen as the pupil who aspired most of all to become a second Rembrandt. He must have stayed in close contact with his former teacher during the 1640s. In those years, he produced many strongly Rembrandtesque paintings and etchings. This painting, in the collection of Museo Thyssen-Bornemisza, dates from about 1647, and it follows the example of Rembrandt's girl leaning on a windowsill from 1645. An anecdote from a late 17th century French spy, political spy, and art lover, Roger de Pile, identifies the function of Rembrandt's painting of a servant leaning out of a window as an artistic experiment. According to the anecdote, Rembrandt placed the painting in the window of his house at Breestraat for people passing by to be fooled. And here's a sort of trial. We placed a reproduction of the painting in front of a window of the old house on Breestraat, Rembrandt's house, part of the museum where I work. And the anecdote states that people were passing by, and only after a few days they found out that the girl was not real, but that she was painted, because she was sitting constantly in the same form. This, of course, underlined the quality of Rembrandt's artistic abilities and mastership in connection, of course, to that myth of Zeuxis and Parrhasius. The concept of a figure leaning out of a window was developed in the 1640s. but it became even more popular during the beginning of the 1650s, and Bol produced several versions of ladies in niches, in paintings, but also in etchings. Like, for example, here on the left, an anonymous lady playing a lute. In the center, we see an etching of a lady holding up a pear. And a pear means, in the 17th century, is a symbol of the fertility of a woman. So there are poems by Jacob Cats which state that a woman, when she is ripe, when she is fruitful, she has to be picked at the right moment. And you shouldn't wait too long, because like a pear, time is over very soon. So a lady has to be picked on the right time. And then on the right-hand side, we see a fantastic portrait, which was on auction last year, I think, at Christie's. A fantastic portrait of a woman leaning out of a windowsill. So the stone part is very convincing, but then again, the ridge around it is just wood. So again, you wonder: is it a painting? Is it a frame? Is it a what is she in? Is it really a window, or what are we looking at? So this is also a fantastic example of that concept. Furthermore, Bol was active, like Rembrandt, as a painter of history pieces. And this I have to show you, because in 1656, Bol was commissioned to paint one of the two chimney pieces for the burgomaster's room in the new town hall on Dam Square. These were highly prestigious commissions for this immense building, which was presented as the 8th wonder of the world. And here we see the building. Govert Flinck, also a former pupil of Rembrandt, was asked to paint the other chimney piece in the room, in the very same room. And now that we are here in Museo Thyssen, I have to show you this painting by Pieter de Hoog, which is in the museum's collection, and you can find it in the permanent display. And there we see this burgomaster's room. And in the back we can see part of that painting by Bol. But Pieter de Hoog also used the freedom of illusion by suggesting a curtain which opens up, by which he reveals his painted world to us. Yet again, also connotation to that curtain myth and the art of painting. In that very Amsterdam Town Hall building we are now looking at, but another room, another fascinating painting was installed in that year 1656. This fantastic trompe-l'œil. It is one of the key works in the current exhibition here in Madrid. The painter was the Dutch artist Cornelis Brizet. He was commissioned by the Amsterdam city government to paint his artwork for the Thesaurie Ordinaris of the new town hall. In this office, the finances of the city were managed and administered. So a still life of archival material was very fitting for the space. The commission resulted in a spectacular trompe-l'œil, which is of quite a large size, 2.5 meters wide and almost 2 meters high. In a poem on the artwork by the famous writer Jan Vos, it is described how the painting was hanging above the door in the office. On the painting, we see a still life of 8 so-called liassen, a typical way of collecting and bundling paperwork by sticking them together with a thread and a needle, which fixed them to a wooden board. These small boards were hung on nails, which are fixated to a large wooden board, a wooden wall. And all of this is painted on a piece of canvas. From upper left to right, we can read on the liasses on top, reizengeld, which is travel money, processen, which means trials, fabriekamt, bureau of the city architect, extraordinaris quitantiën, exceptional receipts. And in the lower row, we can read from left to right, ordinaris wedden, so regular salaries, quitantiën van groten excise, receipts of large taxes, koping van erven of gronden, acquisition of land, and barning, which means fuel. Below, we see a bunch of bags with money, some paperwork and 2 drawings. And the one on the left is a rendition of a painting by Titian showing heavenly and earthly love now in the Galleria Borghese in Rome. And a number of these documents on the liaison are identifiable. They are renderings of real, still existing documents. And these are the maps which are related to the 4th extension of the city of Amsterdam, which was realized in 1660. So this, and here's a map. So besides the spectacular effect of paperwork on the wall, which must have corresponded with physical true liaison paperwork which was present in that same room, so the illusion of the painting was connected to the actual surroundings, the painting symbolized the immense range of activities of the treasurers and the ambition of the city to expand and fortify the city further after the city had been under attack of military troops in 1650. The famous Dutch poet Joost van de Vondel wrote an ode to this painting, which is still readable in a cartouche on the lower side of the frame. You can see it when you're in the exhibition. It reads, translated into English, "People say the art of printing and writing will run to waste, now that the province of Holland has prohibited the use of French paper. Leave this worry behind, said the treasurer of Amsterdam, since Brisé is ordering paper when he starts to paint. Look at this scene. What do you see up there? Papers, diploma, and letters? Or are looks deceiving our eye?" And this mentioning of the prohibition of the use of French paper was all related to the fact that in the mid-1650s, the import of French paper, which was a very good quality, was shortly prohibited to stimulate the production of the Dutch paper mills. So that is what is referred to in this text. So, like we saw, the composition of Brisé is not just an illusion, but one full of meaning. The same goes for all the trompe-l'œil paintings in the exhibition, and this gives these works of art such a fascinating extra dimension. Coming at the end of my talk, I would like to briefly return to Hoogstraten and his letterworks, which are on display here in the exhibition. They too are full of meaning, and in this case, they even form a self-portrait of the painter. We have already looked briefly at one of the two. Let's have a look at the one on loan from the Dordrecht Museum. Hoogstraten painted this letterwork in 1664, during his years in London. In it are several objects included, which are connected to his life and reputation. Behind 3 red bands, all kinds of personal items are stuck, with which Van Hoogstraten shows something of his personal life. A pair of scissors with a pincushion, a fine wooden comb, a turtle one. These objects might refer to his wife, Sarah, who accompanied him on his foreign travel. And the quill pen in the upper right refers to the fact that Van Hoogstraten was not only active as a painter, but also as a writer. On the far right is a rolled-up notebook with a marbled cover, and next to it is a leather book cover with the inscription Anno 1664. In the center we see an envelope on which is written London, with the date 20 January 1664, and this is generally believed to be the date of this painting. Van Hoogstraten's name is written above it. Furthermore, we see 2 medallions on chains with ribbons, and the leftmost of which is the golden one which shows Emperor Ferdinand III, this one. This is the medallion which Hoogstraten had received a decade before when presenting paintings to the emperor in Vienna. The objects on the letterboard are carefully arranged and placed almost in a sprong-like, nonchalant composition. Our eyes move over the picture plane to enjoy all the details in a playful order. Hoogstraten mainly achieved the illusionistic effect through a strongly abridged, foreshortened representation of a number of the objects depicted, an accurate representation of shadows, but also through an exceptional skillful expression of textures and surfaces of the various objects. The use of contrast contributes to the effect of depth, not only by placing the exposed object against a dark background, but also by deliberately combining and opposing certain color combinations, such as red and gold. And here again, like with Rembrandt's portraits which I showed you, we have to look twice. Where does the painting stop? Is the frame painted, or is it real? Since these fascinating letterworks are technically connected to the lessons Samuel van Hoogstraten learned from Rembrandt, I proposed to the museum where I work a few years ago to recreate a letterwork in reality. So, when we decorated Rembrandt's office in his very house on Breestraat, we tried it out. And we also added a small lias. It hangs on the door of the cupboard. It was great fun to try out if such practical systems truly function, and they do. And guess what? They look like a painting. So now I invite you to go back to the exhibition once more, and hopefully you can find new connections. Enjoy the theater which these illusionistic artists have laid out for us with all their technique, artistic ambition, and creativity. Thank you for your attention.